Into the shadows. The night air carried an unsettling stillness, a kind that wrapped tightly around the senses. Detective Martin Cross shivered under the weight of his coat as he stepped out of the abandoned warehouse. The scene had been routine, or so it seemed, a string of petty thefts that led to this decrepit structure on the edge of town. Nothing unusual, yet something nagged at him. His gut whispered that he was missing something critical, but no evidence had surfaced to confirm it. He reached for his phone, the faint glow illuminating his rugged features. Nothing here. Heading home, he texted to his partner, Detective Emily Lane. She was still at the precinct, working late as usual. Martin pocketed the device, climbed into his car, and pulled away from the scene. The drive was quiet, the dim glow of streetlights his only companion. But Martin never made it home. By dawn, the city buzzed with unease. News had spread. Detective Martin Cross was missing. His car was found abandoned on the outskirts of Route 56, the driver's door wide open, his badge resting ominously on the passenger seat. It was as if someone wanted it to be found. There were no signs of a struggle, no broken glass, no blood. Just an eerie stillness. Detective Emily Lane stood at the scene, her face drawn with tension. Her sharp eyes scanned the surroundings, noting every detail. Faint tire tracks leading away from the site, scuff marks on the gravel. She crouched near the badge, her hand brushing over the worn leather casing. It was deliberate. Everything about this screamed calculated. Cameras. She barked, snapping her attention to Officer Mason, who was nervously flipping through his notebook. We're pulling footage from the nearest traffic junction. Should have it in an hour. Not good enough, Emily snapped, rising to her full height. If this is premeditated, we're already behind. The officers exchanged uneasy glances. They knew Emily's reputation. Relentless, uncompromising. But this was different. Martin wasn't just her partner. He was her closest friend. Back at the precinct, the mood was somber. Emily stood at the front of the operations room, her eyes fixed on the grainy traffic camera footage playing on the screen behind her. Martin's car slowed to a halt. A shadowy figure stepped into the road, blocking his path. Martin got out, his stance cautious but not alarmed. Then, chaos. Two masked figures emerged, dragging Martin into a dark van before it sped away into the night. The footage cut off abruptly, leaving only questions and a rising dread. Emily's voice was sharp as she addressed the room. Here's what we know. Martin was taken at 11:14 p.m. The suspects are organized, and they knew his route. This isn't random. This is personal. Could it be tied to a case? Officer Mason asked, his tone hesitant. Possibly. Cross-reference his recent investigations, Emily ordered. Mason pulled detailed tire track analysis from the scene. Tran, get me a list of known associates or enemies. Anyone who might hold a grudge. The team moved swiftly, their fear fueling their determination. Emily stayed behind, staring at the whiteboard cluttered with notes and photographs. Her gaze lingered on Martin's picture. His confident smile, his sharp eyes. He'd been her anchor through countless cases, always knowing when to push and when to pull back. She couldn't fail him now. Hours later, Tran, the precinct's tech expert, returned with a grim expression. We've got a lead. Emily turned sharply, her heart pounding. Martin was working a theft case, but it wasn't random. The property belonged to a former informant, someone connected to a larger criminal network. Whoever broke in wasn't after money or goods. They were after leverage. Emily's jaw tightened, and Martin walked straight into it. Tran nodded. It wasn't about revenge. It was about silencing him before he uncovered something bigger. Before Emily could respond, Mason burst into the room, a photograph in hand. We've got the van. The image was blurry but clear enough to make out. A dark van speeding through an intersection an hour after the abduction. The partial license plate was visible. Run it, Emily commanded, and alert the state police. I want roadblocks on every major route. By nightfall, exhaustion weighed heavily on the team, but no one dared to slow down. Emily paced the operations room, phone in hand, waiting for updates. A call finally came through from the state police. "We found the van," the officer reported. "Abandoned in the industrial district. No sign of Cross." Emily didn't hesitate. "Send me the location. We're on our way." The industrial site was a labyrinth of rusting machinery and forgotten crates. The van sat ominously in the center, its doors ajar. Inside, they found Martin's shattered phone and a single playing card, the Ace of Spades. Scrawled across its surface in bold black ink were two chilling words: tick-tock. Emily's blood ran cold. This wasn't just an abduction. This was a game, and the clock was already ticking. Meanwhile, Martin's world was a claustrophobic nightmare. The air was heavy, laced with the earthy scent of wood and metal. His breaths came shallow, each one a battle. As he stretched his hands, they grazed rough planks and cold nails. He was trapped in a wooden box, and panic clawed at him like a living thing. He forced himself to focus. Years of training kicked in, teaching him to compartmentalize his fear. Slowly, he explored his confines, noting every detail: the tight dimensions, the faint hum of machinery, the flicker of a small screen embedded in the lid. It blinked to life, displaying a live feed of himself, his terrified reflection staring back. Then came the voice. "Welcome to your reckoning, Detective Cross." It taunted, robotic and devoid of emotion. "Your team has 48 hours to find you, or this coffin becomes your grave." Tick-tock. The screen cut to a countdown: -47 hours, 59 minutes, and 45 seconds. Martin's chest tightened. He wasn't just a victim. He was bait, and the game had only just begun. Clues in the dark. Detective Emily Lane's knuckles whitened as she gripped the steering wheel, her squad car slicing through the empty streets toward the industrial district. Her heart thudded like a war drum, each beat synchronized with the nagging thought that Martin's time was slipping away. Every second that ticked by felt like another nail in his coffin, and she couldn't shake the image of his badge resting ominously in his abandoned car. The industrial site loomed ahead, a sprawl of rusting skeletons that whispered of a forgotten era. Emily parked near the cordoned-off area where the van had been discovered. Floodlights illuminated the scene, casting sharp shadows that danced across the cracked asphalt. Officers moved in hushed urgency, their flashlights prodding the darkness. "Status." Emily barked as she approached Officer Mason, who stood near the van's open doors. Mason pointed to the Ace of Spades sealed in an evidence bag. This was left in plain sight. No prints, nothing to trace. Emily studied the card, her sharp gaze narrowing. Tick-tock. The phrase echoed in her mind, and she clenched her fists to suppress the rising anger. "Anything else?" "Just this," Mason replied, gesturing to the van's interior. Martin's phone lay shattered on the floor, its screen cracked like a spider's web. Beside it, a small, faintly glowing device blinked steadily. Emily crouched, examining the object. A GPS tracker, but its configuration was unfamiliar. "Tech," she called, summoning Alex Tran, the precinct's digital specialist. Tran hurried over, his portable scanner already whirring. He scanned the device, his face illuminated by the faint green glow of his screen. "This isn't standard," Tran muttered, his brow furrowing. "It's custom-made. Whoever set this up knows their tech." Emily straightened, her jaw tight. "Can you trace it?" Tran nodded but hesitated. "I'll need time. They've encrypted the signal, but if I can piggyback off the nearest cell tower, I might get a lead." Emily gave a curt nod. "Do it. I want results yesterday." A message from the dark. Hours later, back at the precinct, Emily stood before the team in the operations room. The whiteboard behind her had transformed into a chaotic mosaic of notes, photos, and timelines. Martin's picture was at the center, a silent reminder of what was at stake. "Here's what we know," Emily began, her voice steady despite the fatigue etched into her face. Martin was taken from Route 56, and his captors are methodical. This isn't random. It's calculated. Tran raised a hand, holding up his tablet. I've cracked the tracker's signal. It's routing through multiple servers to mask its origin, but I traced the last unprotected ping to an abandoned warehouse 3 miles from where the van was found. Emily's heart leaped. Good work. Get me the address. But there's more, Tran added, his tone grim. The tracker isn't just transmitting its location. It's sending live audio from the Coffin. The room fell silent as Tran played the recording. The sound of Martin's labored breathing filled the air, punctuated by faint scratching. Then came a voice, distorted, robotic. Time is running out, Detective Lane. The clock is ticking. Will you save your partner, or will you fail like the others? Emily's blood ran cold. The others? She repeated, her voice barely above a whisper. What does that mean? Tran shook his head. It's vague, but they're taunting us. Whoever's behind this wants you to feel the pressure. Emily's jaw tightened. Well, they've got my attention. The warehouse. The address Tran uncovered led Emily and her team to a crumbling warehouse on the outskirts of the city. The structure loomed like a forgotten sentinel, its corrugated metal siding streaked with rust. The surrounding area was desolate, save for the faint hum of a distant highway. Emily gestured for silence as the team approached. Tactical officers moved in formation, their weapons drawn and their movements precise. Tran stayed behind in the surveillance van, monitoring the feeds from their body cameras. Emily reached the entrance, her heart pounding as she pushed the door open. The air inside was damp and heavy, the faint smell of oil and decay permeating the space. Shafts of moonlight streamed through broken windows, illuminating dust motes that danced in the still air. Spread out, Emily whispered into her radio. Look for anything that connects to Martin. The team fanned out, their flashlights cutting through the darkness. Emily's gaze was sharp, scanning for any detail out of place. Then she saw it, a small, flickering light near the center of the warehouse. She signaled for backup and approached cautiously. The light emanated from a tablet, its screen displaying a live feed of Martin. He was trapped in a wooden coffin, his face pale and his breathing shallow. The timer on the screen ticked relentlessly, 38:12:47. Emily's stomach twisted. We're running out of time. Her earpiece crackled. Detective Lane, Tran's voice came through, tense but steady. That tablet is rigged. Motion sensors. If you move it, it might trigger a failsafe. Emily froze, her mind racing. Can you disable it remotely? Not without more time, Tran replied. But I can try to backtrace the signal. Do it, Emily said, stepping back from the tablet. She turned to the nearest officer. Secure this area. I don't want anyone near that device. A harrowing discovery. As the team combed through the warehouse, Emily's radio crackled again. Detective Lane, Officer Mason's voice came through, laced with urgency. You're going to want to see this. Emily hurried to Mason's location, where he stood near a stack of rusted shipping containers. He pointed to a wall covered in photographs and notes, each one pinned with precision. Emily's breath caught. The photographs were of her team, candid shots taken without their knowledge. Notes accompanied each picture, detailing their routines, habits, and vulnerabilities. At the center of the display was a large image of Martin, circled in red. This is a surveillance board, Emily said, her voice low. They've been watching us for weeks. Mason nodded grimly. And it gets worse. He handed her a note scrawled in jagged handwriting. You think you can save him? Tick-tock, Detective Lane. Emily's grip on the note tightened. The clock was ticking, and her adversary was always one step ahead. But she wouldn't stop. Not until Martin was safe, and whoever was behind this was in cuffs. As she turned back to the surveillance board, her determination solidified. This was more than a game to her captor, it was personal, and Emily was prepared to fight tooth and nail to beat them at it. Race against shadows. The precinct buzzed with activity as dawn crept over the horizon, but the tension in the air was palpable. Detective Emily Lane paced in front of the operations board, her mind a whirlwind of possibilities. She couldn't stop replaying the live feed from the warehouse in her head. Martin trapped in that coffin, the timer relentlessly counting down. 38 hours, 12 minutes, 47 seconds. Now, the countdown was at 34 hours, and they still had no tangible leads. Detective Lane, Tran called from his workstation, his voice snapping her out of her thoughts. She hurried over as he gestured toward his screen. I've backtraced the signal from the tablet at the warehouse. It's bouncing off proxy servers, but there's a pattern in the routing. It's originating from somewhere within the city. Can you narrow it down? Emily asked, leaning over his shoulder. Tran nodded, his fingers flying across the keyboard. I've cross-referenced the signal's bounce points with areas that have consistent power surges. Whoever set this up needs a steady power supply for the live feed. That gives us 3 possible locations. Emily studied the highlighted map on his screen. Each location was remote. An abandoned office building, a disused water treatment plant, and an old subway station no longer in use. Focus on the subway station first, she said. It's the most isolated and has access to a wide area underground. Tran nodded, already pulling up schematics of the station. Emily turned to Officer Mason, who stood nearby. Assemble the team. We're heading out in 15. The subway station. The old subway station was a cavernous relic, its tiled walls cracked and faded. A faint musty smell hung in the air, mingling with the metallic tang of rusted rails. Emily led the tactical team into the station, their footsteps echoing ominously in the empty space. Stay sharp, Emily whispered into her radio. We don't know what we're walking into. Tran's voice crackled through her earpiece. I'm monitoring the signal. If they're here, the feed should spike when we get closer. The team moved in silence, sweeping the area with flashlights. Broken benches and discarded debris littered the platform, but there was no immediate sign of activity. Emily's gaze darted to the dark tunnels stretching out into the unknown. Movement, Mason said softly, his flashlight catching a flicker of motion near the far end of the platform. Emily signaled for the team to move forward. They advanced cautiously, weapons drawn, until they reached a cluster of maintenance lockers. One of the doors was slightly ajar, and Emily pushed it open with her foot. Inside, they found a laptop running the live feed of Martin's coffin. The countdown timer glared from the screen. 32 hours, 45 minutes, 13 seconds. Tran, Emily said into her radio. We found another device. I'm picking up the signal, Tran replied. Same encryption. Whoever set this up didn't intend to stay here long. Emily scanned the locker, her eyes landing on a discarded envelope. She picked it up and opened it, revealing a single sheet of paper with 2 words typed in bold. Keep digging. Her stomach twisted. This was another breadcrumb, another deliberate misdirection. They're toying with us, she muttered under her breath. Detective, Mason called from nearby. He held up a scrap of fabric. It was torn, blood-stained, and unmistakably part of the shirt Martin had been wearing the night he disappeared. Emily's fists clenched. Whoever was behind this wanted her to know they were always one step ahead. She turned to the team. Secure the area. Tran, cross-referenced the other 2 locations. We're not stopping until we find something concrete. The water treatment plant. The next location was an abandoned water treatment plant on the outskirts of the city. The building's towering silos and crumbling infrastructure loomed like silent sentinels against the morning sky. Emily's team approached with heightened caution, aware that the stakes were climbing with every passing minute. As they entered the main facility, the air was damp and oppressive, the faint drip of water echoing through the vast space. The walls were covered in graffiti, some of it recent, suggesting the area had seen visitors. Split into pairs, Emily ordered. Sweep every room, every corridor. If there's anything here, I want it found. She moved with Mason, their flashlights cutting through the darkness as they navigated the maze-like structure. In one corner of the plant, they discovered a makeshift workstation, an old table littered with maps, tools, and more cryptic notes. "Detective Lane," Mason said, pointing to a map pinned to the wall. It was a detailed layout of the city, with several locations marked in red, including the warehouse, the subway station, and a water treatment plant. "They've been planning this for weeks," Emily said, her voice low. "This isn't just about Martin. This is about us, about control." Her radio crackled. "Detective Lane, you need to see this," came Tran's voice. Emily and Mason hurried to Tran's location near the central water tanks. There, in the shadow of a massive rusted pipe, they found a small metal box wired with electronics. Tran crouched beside it, his expression grim. "This is a relay," he explained. "It's boosting the signal for the live feed. But it's also a decoy." "What do you mean?" Emily asked, kneeling beside him. Tran pointed to the wiring. "This relay is designed to send us in circles. The real signal source is somewhere else." Emily's frustration boiled over. "Then find it. We're running out of time." Tran nodded, his fingers already working to dismantle the device. Emily stood and scanned the area, her mind racing. This wasn't a wild goose chase. It was a game. A meticulously crafted puzzle designed to test their resolve. A deadly message. Back at the precinct, Emily slammed a map onto the table, her finger jabbing at the remaining location. An abandoned office building near the edge of the city. "This has to be it. They've been leading us in circles, but it all points back here." Tran looked up from his computer. "I've isolated the signal. It's coming from somewhere near that building, but I can't pinpoint it without getting closer." Emily's phone buzzed, and she glanced at the screen. Another video message. Her stomach dropped as she opened it. The screen showed Martin, his breathing labored, his face pale and slick with sweat. The voice from earlier returned, distorted but clear. "Tick-tock, Detective Lane. You're closer than you think, but you're still not fast enough. Are you ready to lose everything?" Emily's grip on the phone tightened as rage bubbled to the surface. "We're not losing him," she said through gritted teeth. "Not now. Not ever." She turned to the team. "Gear up. We're finishing this." Into the lion's den. The abandoned office building loomed in the distance, a decaying husk of its former self. Its cracked windows and crumbling facade whispered of forgotten days, but for Detective Emily Lane and her team, it might as well have been a fortress. It was their last lead, and the stakes couldn't be higher. With 29 hours remaining on the clock, they couldn't afford another dead end. Emily crouched near the back of the command van, the hum of its electronics a faint backdrop to the rising tension. Tran's fingers danced across his laptop keyboard, monitoring live feeds from the drones circling the building. Officer Mason stood beside her, tightening the straps on his vest. "We've got 3 entry points," Tran announced, his voice steady but taut. The front entrance, a side stairwell, and a maintenance access hatch around the rear. No visible movement, but the signal's definitely strongest here. Emily nodded, her sharp gaze locked on the monitor. "They know we're coming. They've been ahead of us every step, but not this time." She turned to her team, their faces grim but resolute. "We go in silent. Mason, take a unit through the side stairwell. Tran, keep the drones overhead and monitor all exits. I'll lead the main entry team. No one takes unnecessary risks. We bring Martin home, alive." The officers nodded, their determination mirroring her own. They moved swiftly, their footsteps barely audible on the cracked pavement as they approached the building. Emily's heart pounded in her chest, but she pushed the fear aside. Martin was counting on her. Inside the trap. The air inside the building was thick with dust, each step stirring up faint clouds that glimmered in the beams of their flashlights. The silence was oppressive, broken only by the occasional creak of the floorboards and the faint hum of distant machinery. Emily led the main team through the ground floor, her sharp eyes scanning every shadow. Old desks and overturned chairs littered the space, relics of a once busy workplace now abandoned to time. A faint, rhythmic ticking echoed through the building, sending a shiver down her spine. "Tran, what's that sound?" She whispered into her radio. "I'm working on it," Tran replied. "It's faint but consistent. Could be mechanical, something rigged to throw us off." Emily clenched her jaw. "Stay on it." The team reached a central hallway, where a set of double doors loomed at the end. Emily raised her hand, signaling for silence. She pushed the doors open slowly, revealing a large conference room. At the center of the room was a table, and on it, a laptop displayed the all-too-familiar live feed of Martin in the coffin. The timer glared at her, 28:17:06. Her breath hitched as the screen flickered, and the distorted voice returned. "Welcome, Detective Lane. I knew you'd make it this far." Emily's grip on her flashlight tightened. "Where is he?" she demanded, her voice sharp. The voice chuckled, cold and mocking. "So impatient. You're closer than you think, but patience is a virtue, isn't it? Don't worry. You'll find him, if you're clever enough." The screen cut to black, leaving the room in oppressive silence. "Detective." Mason's voice crackled through her earpiece, his tone urgent. "We found something. 4th floor, northeast corner. You need to see this." A grim discovery. Emily's team ascended the stairwell quickly, their boots barely making a sound on the cracked steps. When they reached the 4th floor, Mason and his unit were waiting near a room with its door slightly ajar. "It's a setup," Mason said, his voice low. "But it's meant for us." Emily stepped into the room cautiously. It was bare except for a single chair in the center. Strapped to the chair was a mannequin dressed in a police uniform, a badge pinned to its chest, with Martin's name engraved on it. Around its neck hung a laminated card with bold, taunting words, "Still too slow." Her stomach twisted as she scanned the room. It was more than a taunt. It was a psychological blow, meant to rattle her and the team. She refused to let it. "Check every inch of this room," Emily ordered. "Walls, floors, ceiling. There has to be something." As the team searched, Tran's voice came through the radio. "Detective Lane, I've got movement. Rear entrance, ground floor. 2 individuals, hooded." Emily's pulse quickened. "Do not engage yet. Let them come to us." The encounter. The hooded figures moved cautiously through the building, their movements captured by the drones. Emily's team repositioned, closing in from all sides. She signaled for silence, her breath steady despite the adrenaline coursing through her veins. As the figures approached the central stairwell, Emily and Mason emerged from the shadows, weapons drawn. "Freeze!" Emily barked, her voice cutting through the air like a blade. The figures stopped, their hands slowly rising. One of them laughed, the sound muffled but unmistakably smug. "You think you're close," the taller of the two said, his voice calm despite the situation. "But you're not." Emily stepped closer, her weapon trained on him. "Where is Martin?" The man tilted his head, as if amused. "You're asking the wrong questions, detective." Before Emily could respond, the second figure lunged forward, throwing something toward the ground. A blinding flash erupted, and smoke filled the air. Emily coughed, her vision blurred as chaos erupted around her. "Secure the exits," she shouted, her voice cutting through the confusion. When the smoke cleared, the figures were gone. All that remained was another note, pinned to the wall with a knife. Tick-tock. Piecing it together. Back at the precinct, Emily stood over the whiteboard, her frustration mounting. The taunts, the decoys, the calculated misdirections. It was all designed to wear them down, but she wouldn't let it. Tran approached, his expression grim but determined. "Detective, I've isolated the signal's true origin. It wasn't coming from the office building or the warehouse. It's being routed from a private compound just outside the city." Emily's eyes narrowed. "Who owns it?" Tran hesitated before answering. Nathan Carter, ex-police, fired 3 years ago for corruption. Martin was the lead investigator on his case. Emily's heart sank. She remembered Carter, a manipulative and vengeful man who had sworn revenge on everyone involved in his downfall. "That's our guy," she said, her voice low but firm. "He's been planning this for years." She turned to the team. "Gear up. We're going to end this." The compound. The private compound was surrounded by dense woods, its high walls and locked gates a testament to its owner's paranoia. Emily's team approached under cover of darkness, using trans drones to map the area. They identified several guards patrolling the perimeter, armed and alert. "This isn't just a hideout," Mason said as they regrouped. "This is a fortress." Emily's jaw tightened. "Then we break through." With precision and coordination, the team neutralized the guards one by one, moving closer to the main building. Inside, the air was thick with tension. Emily led the charge, her weapon steady as they cleared room after room. Finally, they reached a locked door at the end of a long hallway. From behind it came the faint hum of machinery and the ticking of a clock. Emily's heart pounded as she signaled for Tran to breach the lock. The door swung open, revealing a dimly lit room. At its center was the coffin, surrounded by wires and monitors. The timer read 27 hours, 02 minutes, 11 seconds. "Martin!" Emily shouted, rushing to the coffin. Tran hurried to the controls, his hands deftly disabling the mechanisms. The rest of the team secured the room, ensuring no one could interfere. As the coffin lid creaked open, Emily's breath caught. Martin lay inside, pale and weak but alive. His eyes fluttered open, and a faint smile crossed his lips. "Emily," he whispered, his voice barely audible. "Took you long enough." Relief washed over her, but it was fleeting. This wasn't over, not yet. The man behind this twisted game was still out there, and Emily wouldn't rest until he was brought to justice. The hunter becomes the hunted. Martin Cross lay on a stretcher in the makeshift command post outside the compound, oxygen mask over his face as paramedics worked to stabilize him. His face was pale, his breaths shallow, but he was alive. Emily Lane watched from the corner of the tent, her arms crossed and her expression steeled. Relief was tempered by the bitter knowledge that this was far from over. "This doesn't end here," she muttered, her voice low but sharp. "Nathan Carter planned this too perfectly. He wanted us to find Martin, but he's still out there." Tran, seated at a portable workstation nearby, looked up. "I've been combing through the data we pulled from the compound systems. Carter left a trail, but it's deliberate. He's baiting us again." Emily leaned over the screen, her eyes narrowing as she scanned the data. Coordinates, cryptic notes, and images of the team, including herself, were displayed. One file was labeled Endgame. "What's in that file?" Emily asked. Tran hesitated. "It's encrypted. I'm working on breaking it, but it's complex. Carter must have anticipated we'd get this far." Emily's jaw tightened. "Keep at it. We're not giving him the satisfaction of thinking he's in control." A ghost in the wind. As the team regrouped, Emily called a meeting. They stood in a circle, faces grim, the tension palpable. Martin, though weak, insisted on sitting up from the stretcher to listen. His voice was hoarse, but the determination in his eyes mirrored Emily's own. "He's not done with us," Martin rasped, removing the oxygen mask. "The way he operates, everything's layered. This isn't just about me. It's about breaking us, one piece at a time." Emily nodded. "Which means we need to be smarter. Every move we've made has been in reaction to him. That ends now." She turned to Mason. "Set up a perimeter around the compound. I don't want so much as a squirrel getting through without us knowing. Tran, crack that file. It's our best lead. And someone get me everything we have on Carter's known associates, hideouts, and assets." Mason nodded. "We've got eyes on the ground, but he could already be gone." Emily's gaze hardened. "Then we flush him out. Unraveling the puzzle." Hours passed as the team pored over the data, their focus razor-sharp. Tran finally broke the encryption on the endgame file, his triumphant shout cutting through the tension. "Got it," he exclaimed, spinning his laptop around to face Emily. She leaned in, her brow furrowing as she read the document. It was a detailed plan. Timelines, routes, and contingencies, all leading to a single chilling conclusion. Carter wasn't just playing a game. He was staging a public spectacle. "This can't be right," Mason said, reading over Emily's shoulder. "He's planning to broadcast a live execution." Emily's stomach churned as she continued reading. The file detailed a location, a remote airfield on the outskirts of the city. The timestamp indicated the event would occur in less than 24 hours. The file also included plans to lure law enforcement into a trap, with explosives rigged to detonate if anyone interfered. "This isn't just about us," Emily said, her voice low but cold. "Carter wants to send a message, to the public, to anyone who's ever stood against him." Martin shifted on the stretcher, his voice strained but firm. "Then we stop him before he gets the chance." The airfield. The airfield was a desolate stretch of cracked tarmac and rusting hangars, surrounded by fields overgrown with weeds. Emily's team arrived under the cover of darkness, using Tran's drones to scout the area. The drones revealed several guards patrolling the perimeter, heavily armed and alert. "Carter's not taking any chances," Mason said, studying the live feed. "This place is locked down tight." Emily nodded, her mind racing. "He's expecting us to come straight at him. We won't." She crouched over the map of the airfield, pointing to a drainage tunnel that ran beneath the tarmac. "We split into 2 teams. Mason, you take the main force and create a diversion near the south entrance. I'll lead the second team through the tunnels and breach the hangar where Carter's likely to be." Tran hesitated. The tunnels could be rigged. Carter's meticulous. He might have planned for this. Emily's gaze didn't waver. "We don't have a choice. If we don't act now, he wins." The final countdown. The diversion worked. Mason's team engaged the guards at the south entrance, drawing their attention away from the main hangar. Gunfire echoed across the airfield, the sharp cracks cutting through the night. Meanwhile, Emily's team moved silently through the drainage tunnel, their flashlights barely illuminating the damp, narrow space. The air was thick with tension, every step calculated. At the far end of the tunnel, they found a ladder leading up to a hatch. Emily signaled for silence as she pushed the hatch open, emerging into the shadows of the main hangar. The cavernous space was eerily quiet, the faint hum of machinery the only sound. At the center of the hangar stood a platform, and on it, a chair rigged with explosives. Above it, a large screen displayed a countdown. 2:15:30. "Fan out," Emily whispered. "Find Carter." Her team moved swiftly, their weapons drawn. Emily climbed onto the platform, her heart pounding as she examined the setup. The chair was empty, but it was wired with enough explosives to level a hangar. "Tran," she whispered into her radio. "Can you disable this remotely?" Tran's voice crackled back. "I'm already on it, but it's complicated. Carter's using a remote trigger. If he's nearby, he can detonate it at any time." Emily's blood ran cold. "Then we find him. Now." The confrontation. A slow clap echoed through the hangar, freezing Emily in her tracks. She turned sharply, her weapon trained on the source of the sound. Nathan Carter emerged from the shadows, his expression calm, almost smug. "Detective Lane," he said, his voice laced with mockery. "You've been a worthy opponent. I'll give you that." Emily didn't lower her weapon. "It's over, Carter. Step away from the controls." Carter laughed, shaking his head. "You still don't get it, do you? This was never about winning or losing. It's about showing the world the price of betrayal." He held up a small device, the detonator. Emily's heart raced as her mind calculated her options. "You think this will make you a martyr," she said, her voice steady. "You're just a coward hiding behind Theatrix." Carter's smirk faltered. anger flickering in his eyes. "Say what you want, but when that clock hits 0, they'll remember my name." Emily's radio crackled. "Detective, I've isolated his signal. If you can keep him talking, I can disable the explosives." Emily stepped forward, her weapon unwavering. "You're not as clever as you think, Carter. You left a trail, and now we're here. You've lost." Carter's hand tightened on the detonator. "Do you really think you can outsmart me? This whole game has been on my terms." Emily took another step forward. "The game's over. A race against time." The moment stretched, tension crackling in the air. Then, with a sudden burst of movement, Carter pressed the detonator. Nothing happened. His smug expression morphed into confusion, then rage. "Tran," Emily whispered into her radio. "Status." "I've disabled the trigger," Tran replied. "But the timer's still active." Emily didn't hesitate. She lunged at Carter, tackling him to the ground. They grappled, the detonator clattering away. Carter fought viciously, but Emily's determination was unyielding. She delivered a swift strike, rendering him unconscious. "Secure him," she shouted to her team. "Tran, how much time?" 30 seconds, Tran replied, his voice tense. "You need to get out of there." Emily's team scrambled out of the hangar, carrying Carter with them. Emily was the last to leave, her legs burning as she sprinted toward safety. She reached cover just as the timer hit 0. The explosion rocked the airfield, the hangar collapsing in a plume of fire and smoke. Emily turned to her team, her chest heaving. Carter lay unconscious, his plans reduced to rubble. For the first time in days, Emily allowed herself a moment of relief. The nightmare was over. The aftermath of fire. The explosion lit up the night sky, a fiery plume rising from the collapsed hangar. Shrapnel and debris rained down, the deafening roar giving way to a tense, ringing silence. Detective Emily Lane knelt behind a rusted storage container, her heart hammering against her ribs. Smoke and dust hung heavy in the air, obscuring the scene. "Everyone check in," Emily called into her radio, coughing as the acrid air burned her lungs. One by one, voices crackled back. "Mason here. We're clear. Tran's good. I've got Carter's location on the tracker. Perimeter team accounted for." Emily exhaled, relief washing over her. She pulled herself to her feet, brushing dirt from her jacket. "Secure Carter and bring him to the extraction point. We're taking him in alive." Carter's capture. Nathan Carter sat slumped against a reinforced vehicle, his hands cuffed behind his back. Blood trickled from a cut on his temple, but the defiance in his eyes burned as brightly as ever. "You think you've won," Carter sneered, his voice raspy. This was just the beginning. Emily crouched in front of him, her gaze piercing. "Your beginning just ended in flames, Carter. We found Martin. We stopped your explosives, and now you're going to prison." Carter's lips twisted into a bitter smile. "You can't stop the message, Detective. They've already seen it." Emily's eyes narrowed. "What message?" He leaned forward, his voice dropping to a conspiratorial whisper. "I wasn't the only one. Others will carry the torch. This system you love so much. It's rotten, and people like me. We're here to tear it down." Emily's jaw tightened, but she refused to give him the satisfaction of a reaction. "Enjoy your torch from behind bars." A clue in the rubble. As Carter was hauled away by officers, Emily turned her attention to the wreckage of the hangar. The fire had mostly died down, leaving charred remains scattered across the tarmac. Tran approached, his tablet in hand. "Detective," he began, his tone urgent. "While you were taking down Carter, I kept digging through his files. There's something you need to see." Emily followed Tran to the command van, where he pulled up a video file. The grainy footage showed Carter speaking directly to the camera, his expression calm and calculated. "If you're watching this," Carter said in the video, "it means they've caught me. But don't celebrate just yet. This isn't about one man. It's about the system that destroys lives in the name of justice. To those who hear my call, Rise up. This fight is far from over. The video ended with coordinates flashing on the screen, locations scattered across the city. Emily's stomach dropped. These are staging points. Tran nodded grimly. He's been working with others, Detective. This was never just about him. The clock resets. Emily stepped out of the van, the weight of the revelation pressing down on her. The air was still thick with the smell of smoke, and the night felt colder than before. Martin, now stabilized and seated on a stretcher, watched her approach. Despite his pale complexion, his eyes were sharp. "What's the verdict?" he asked. Emily sat beside him, her shoulders heavy with exhaustion. Carter was just a cog in a much larger machine. He left behind a network, others who are ready to pick up where he left off. Martin sighed, leaning back against the stretcher. "It's never simple, is it?" "No," Emily replied, her voice steely. "But we're not done. We'll tear this network apart, piece by piece." Martin managed a faint smile. "That's the lane I know." She looked at him, the weight of the past few days etched into her features. "We couldn't have done this without you, Martin. You gave us the clues we needed to find you." "Next time," Martin said, his voice light despite the gravity of the situation, "let's skip the coffin." Emily chuckled, the sound a rare moment of levity in the midst of chaos. "Deal." A city on edge. The team regrouped at the precinct in the early hours of the morning, exhaustion evident in their movements, but replaced with a new sense of urgency. Emily stood at the head of the operations room, the board behind her now updated with Carter's network of locations. "This isn't just about retaliation," she began, her voice commanding the room's attention. "Carter's group has been planning this for years. They've infiltrated supply chains, recruited from within the system, and created a network designed to destabilize the city." Tran stepped forward, adding, "The files we recovered suggest coordinated attacks. Small scale, but enough to sow chaos." Officer Mason crossed his arms, his face grim. "What's the plan?" Emily's gaze swept the room. "We hit them before they hit us. We coordinate with every precinct, lock down vulnerable areas, and root out every member of this network. We don't let Carter's message reach anyone else." The beginning of the end. As the room broke into action, Emily lingered by the whiteboard, her eyes fixed on the map of the city. The battle wasn't over. It had only just begun. Carter might have been the face of the operation, but his reach extended far beyond what they'd uncovered. Martin approached, his steps slow but steady. "You'll stop them," he said, his voice filled with quiet confidence. Emily glanced at him, a small but determined smile tugging at her lips. "We will. Together." With that, she turned back to the board, her mind already racing through the next steps. The clock might have reset, but Emily Lane was no stranger to pressure. And this time, she wasn't just fighting for one life. She was fighting for an entire city. The final hour. The precinct was a hive of controlled chaos. Phones rang incessantly, officers darted between desks, and the low hum of voices created an electric tension in the air. Emily Lane stood at the center of it all, a pillar of resolve amid the storm. Her gaze was fixed on the large monitor at the head of the room, where Tran was displaying a map of the city dotted with red markers, locations linked to Nathan Carter's network. "We've got 12 hours, Emily announced, her voice cutting through the noise. "That's how long we estimate before Carter's followers move on their next targets. This isn't just about chaos anymore. It's about control. They want to send a message that no one is safe." Officer Mason leaned forward, studying the map. "What's the plan?" Emily's gaze didn't waver. "We hit them before they hit us." "Tran, what's the priority target?" Tran tapped on his tablet, and one of the red markers expanded. "This warehouse on the east side. It's flagged in Carter's files as a supply hub, likely where they're storing explosives and equipment." Emily nodded. "Mason, you and your team secure the warehouse. Tran, keep monitoring the other sites. We can't afford to overlook anything." "And what about you?" Mason asked, his brow furrowing. Emily's expression hardened. I'm going after the leadership. If we can take out their command, the rest of the network will collapse. The hunt for the puppet masters. Emily's next lead came from Carter himself. After hours of questioning, he finally let something slip. A name, Evelyn Price. A known associate of Carter's during his time on the force. Evelyn had vanished after his arrest, leaving behind only whispers of her involvement in underground networks. Tran pulled up her last known location, a secluded property on the outskirts of town. Emily didn't waste a second. She assembled a small, specialized unit and set out under the cover of dusk. The property was a sprawling estate, surrounded by tall fences and dense trees. The team parked a quarter-mile away and approached on foot, their movements silent and precise. Surveillance shows minimal activity. Tran's voice crackled through Emily's earpiece. But there's an active power grid. Someone's home. Emily signaled for the team to fan out. She approached the main entrance, her gun drawn. The door was locked, but not for long. One of the team's tactical specialists bypassed it within seconds. Inside, the house was eerily quiet. The air smelled faintly of old wood and perfume, a strange juxtaposition that set Emily's nerves on edge. She moved through the darkened halls, her flashlight cutting through the shadows. Clear, Mason's voice came through the radio from another part of the house. Clear, echoed another officer. Emily reached a study at the back of the house. The door was slightly ajar, light spilling out onto the hardwood floor. She pushed it open cautiously, her weapon raised. Inside, Evelyn Price sat behind a large desk, a glass of wine in one hand and a calm smile on her face. "Detective Lane," Evelyn said, her tone smooth and confident. "I was wondering when you'd show up. A deadly game." Emily stepped into the room, her eyes scanning every corner for hidden threats. "Evelyn Price, I'm guessing you know why I'm here." Evelyn tilted her head, her smile never faltering. "Because Nathan Carter couldn't keep his mouth shut." "Typical. You're going to tell me everything," Emily said, her tone icy. "Where the rest of your people are, what their plans are, and how to stop them." Evelyn chuckled, setting her glass down. "You really think you can stop this? Carter was just one cog in a much larger machine. We're everywhere, detective. Even in your own department." Emily's jaw tightened. "Then you'll understand why I can't let you walk away." Evelyn leaned back, her smile fading. "You think you've won, but you're still playing by our rules. Look around. How many officers can you really trust? How many of your people are already compromised?" Emily's hand tightened on her weapon. "Enough." Before Evelyn could respond, one of Emily's team members called over the radio. "Detective, we've got movement outside. Multiple vehicles approaching fast." Evelyn's smile returned. "You didn't think I'd be here alone, did you?" The siege. The first gunshot shattered the quiet, followed by a hail of bullets tearing through the estate's windows. Emily dove for cover behind the desk, Evelyn scrambling to the floor with a panicked gasp. "Hold your positions," Emily barked into her radio. "Mason, what's the status?" "We're pinned down near the front entrance," Mason replied, his voice tight. "They've got us surrounded." Emily glanced at Evelyn, who was now cowering behind the desk. "Stay here," she ordered before slipping out of the room. The estate erupted into chaos. Emily's team engaged the attackers with calculated precision, using the cover of the house to their advantage. Emily moved through the halls, her sharp eyes scanning for an opening to flank the assailants. She reached a side window and peered out. The vehicles were parked just beyond the fence line, their headlights cutting through the darkness. Men in tactical gear moved toward the house, their weapons trained on the windows. "Tran," Emily called, her voice steady despite the chaos. "I need backup. Where are we on reinforcements?" 5 minutes out, Tran replied. "Hold tight." "We don't have 5 minutes," Emily muttered under her breath. Turning the tide. Emily spotted a gas line running along the exterior of the house, its valve exposed near the side yard. An idea formed, reckless but necessary. "Mason," she called over the radio. "I need you to cover me. I'm going for the gas line." "Are you insane?" Mason shot back. "You'll get yourself killed." Emily smirked. "Just trust me." She moved swiftly, dodging between cover as bullets zipped past her. Reaching the valve, she turned it sharply, releasing a hiss of gas into the air. Pulling a flare from her vest, she struck it and tossed it toward the attackers. The resulting explosion rocked the property, sending flames and debris into the night sky. The attackers scattered, their formation broken. "Now," Emily shouted into her radio, "push them back." Her team surged forward, their counterattack precise and relentless. Within minutes, the remaining assailants either surrendered or fled into the darkness. The collapse of a network. With the siege over, Emily returned to the study. Evelyn was still there, her calm demeanor shattered. "Your people are gone," Emily said, her voice cold. "It's over." Evelyn glared at her, defiance flickering in her eyes. "You don't understand. Even if you stop me, others will rise. You can't fight an idea." Emily leaned in close, her voice low but firm. "An idea didn't save Martin from that coffin. An idea didn't plant explosives in my city. People like you did. And we can stop people." Evelyn didn't reply, her expression darkening. Victory and reflection. Back at the precinct, the mood was a mixture of exhaustion and relief. Carter's network had been dismantled, its leaders either captured or on the run. The city had been spared from their plans, but Emily knew the scars would linger. Martin sat in her office, his color returning after hours of rest. "You did it," he said with a faint smile. Emily shook her head. "We did it. But this isn't over. There are still pieces of this puzzle out there." Martin nodded. "Then we keep going. One piece at a time." Emily glanced at the map on her desk, the red markers now crossed out. The battle had been won, but the war was far from over, and Emily Lane was ready for whatever came next. The closing moves. The precinct was quieter now. The chaos of the past days had given way to a tense calm, but it wasn't over. Nathan Carter's network was in disarray, but fragments of his influence remained, whispers of others waiting to take up his cause. Emily Lane stood in the observation room, watching through the one-way glass as Evelyn Price sat in the interrogation room. Despite being surrounded by the stark walls and cold steel of the table, Evelyn appeared composed, her icy glare fixed on the mirror. "Any luck getting her to talk?" Martin's voice came from behind her. His steps were slower than usual, but he refused to let his injuries keep him from returning to the fight. Emily shook her head. "She's stonewalling. She knows how this game is played." Martin leaned against the doorframe. Carter was loud and theatrical. Evelyn's the opposite, subtle, methodical. She's the kind of threat that slips through the cracks. Emily turned to face him. "Which is why we can't let her. If we don't break her, someone else will pick up where Carter left off." Martin nodded, then gestured to the folder in Emily's hand. "What's in there?" Emily glanced at the folder, then handed it to him. "Every detail we've dug up on Evelyn's operations, her connections, her transactions, even her aliases. She's careful, but nobody's invisible." Martin flipped through the pages. "If this doesn't shake her, nothing will." The interrogation. Emily entered the interrogation room, her presence commanding. She placed the folder on the table and took a seat across from Evelyn, who regarded her with a faint smirk. "Detective Lane," Evelyn said, her voice smooth and mocking. "Here to gloat." Emily didn't rise to the bait. Instead, she opened the folder and began laying out photographs, bank statements, and intercepted communications, each one a nail in Evelyn's coffin. "These are your transactions," Emily began, her tone steady. "This is the warehouse where we found your explosives. This is the list of people you've paid to look the other way. You might think you're untouchable, but we've dismantled your entire operation." Evelyn's smirk faltered, but only slightly. "You think cutting off one head stops the beast. "You're wasting your time, detective." Emily leaned forward, her voice low and firm. "You're smart enough to know this doesn't end well for you. The only choice you have is how it ends. Talk, and maybe we'll consider cutting you a deal. Stay silent, and you'll rot in a cell while the world forgets you." Evelyn's jaw tightened, but she said nothing. Emily straightened, gathering the papers and photos. "Take your time. We've got all night." The final blow. Back in the operations room, Tran and Mason were combing through the last of the data recovered from Evelyn's property. Tran tapped on his keyboard, his brow furrowing. "Detective Lane, you're going to want to see this." Emily approached the monitor, where Tran had pulled up a document buried deep in Evelyn's encrypted files. It was a manifesto detailing the next phase of Carter's plan, one that Evelyn had been poised to lead. It listed targets across the city, including government buildings, police precincts, and even hospitals. Emily's stomach turned. How soon were they planning this? Tran highlighted a date at the top of the document. "Tomorrow." Emily turned to Mason. "Get every unit on high alert. We're locking down every target on this list. Nobody moves without clearance." Martin joined them, his face pale as he scanned the document. "This isn't just a plan. It's a declaration of war." Emily's jaw tightened. "Then we make sure they lose. The last stand." That night, Emily coordinated a citywide operation to preempt the remaining members of Carter's network. Officers swarmed the locations on the list, dismantling hidden caches of weapons and explosives. Several arrests were made, and key players in the network were taken into custody. At the same time, Emily returned to the interrogation room. Evelyn sat in the same position, her confidence visibly shaken. "Your people are done," Emily said, her tone cold. "We've seized their weapons, blocked their funding, and arrested their leaders. You've lost." Evelyn's composure cracked, her eyes narrowing. "You think this changes anything? There will always be more." Emily leaned forward, her gaze unwavering. "Then we'll always be here to stop you." For the first time, Evelyn looked away, her silence a small but satisfying victory. The end of the game. As dawn broke, Emily stood outside the precinct, the city skyline painted in soft hues of orange and pink. The weight of the past days clung to her, but for the first time, she allowed herself to breathe. Martin joined her, a cup of coffee in hand. "You did it," he said, handing her the cup. "You stopped them." Emily took a sip, her eyes never leaving the horizon. "We stopped them, but this isn't the end. People like Carter and Evelyn don't just disappear. There's always another threat waiting in the shadows." Martin nodded. "Then we keep fighting." Emily smiled faintly. "Always." The two stood in silence, the city waking up around them. The battle was over, but the war against those who sought to tear it apart would never truly end. And for Emily Lane, that was a fight worth taking on.